to Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent, the Lumina Foundation podcast with newsmakers and thought leaders in the field of learning and training after high school. I'm Dakota Palicki. Improving the education system doesn't just happen. It takes research, policy analysis, feasibility studies, and for those working in higher education, more and more studies before we feel comfortable to pilot something that leads to the next pilot and the next pilot. For many, the speed of change in academia is too slow and the process too exclusionary. Students themselves are often left out of these important conversations. That is until they insert themselves through organizing and advocacy to make sure their voices are heard. Our guests today are no strangers to inserting student voice into important policy and practice decisions. Through their efforts, they are making sure students are heard and accounted for in education reform. And later in today's show, we're really excited to launch a new segment called Pop Ed, where higher education and pop culture come together. It's going to be a lot of fun, so thanks for sticking with us. But first, I had a chance to catch up with Lauren Schandevel, a student at University of Michigan, whose goal to give practical advice to low-income students has turned into a massive online book and into a multi-campus movement.
So at the University of Michigan, back in January, our central student government released a affordability guide, which was about 87 pages long. They had apparently worked on it for a couple years, and the first 10 pages or so of that guide were devoted to budgeting. And it had advice that was pretty tone deaf, like, fire your maid to save money, outsource your, they said insource your chores, which is another way of saying do your own chores, which I thought was a really interesting economic term to use to describe doing your own chores. Do your laundry instead of hiring a service, which is actually pretty common at Michigan. There is a laundry truck that will come by and students pay to have their laundry done somewhere else and then brought back to them. So for, I think, the general student body, it seemed normal, but those aren't the students who are trying to save money or are worried about affordability. And so for lower income students who are actually concerned about affordability, they were pretty offended by some of the content. And they were making jokes and making comments on social media. And I figured, let's capitalize on this energy and create something. And so my initial idea was to bring a group of students together. We would write our own guide and then publish it somehow. But the more I opened it up to more people, not just students, but alumni and some faculty, some administrators, and then people from outside of the university system, the more I realized that the guide itself would really benefit from having all sorts of perspectives. And so I just left it open, and now it's over 100 pages. And there's a lot of really great information in there that even I haven't read all of it.
Wow, over 100 pages. I mean, how is it organized? What's inside of the guide?
So it's pretty disorganized, but there's a general structure. So we have a table of contents, and there are different sections devoted to employment, housing is a big one, scholarships and financial aid, a lot of financial challenges and places where you can find money or get free food. But there's also portions devoted to finding mentors on campus, whether that be with first-generation faculty or with other students who are in similar situations. So connecting students to student orgs that do a lot of work around identity or affordability is also a huge component.
So is it still pretty U of M centric then? Or have you seen this start to be used by other students at other campuses? Because I know you've gotten some good national attention, some crowdsourcing going on. So I was just curious how big and scaled this is getting.
Yeah, so our guide is very U of M centric because that's just kind of the nature of a document like this, is you have the resources that students on campus need to locate and use to help them. But other schools have started making their own documents with information that pertains specifically to their campuses. And so I think we've had, off the top of my head, Carleton College, George Washington University, University of Arizona, University of Texas in Austin, University of Nevada. So all over the country, students are making their own guides with information specific to their schools, which is incredible.
Yeah. So we were just in a room with a bunch of state policymakers, some elected officials, and you were providing some advice about, how can they meaningfully know their students, right? Beyond just general data points, beyond surveys. I was hoping you could share a little bit about some of those thoughts here. How do you advise a policymaker, whether that be a state level policymaker or even someone at an institution, at a university or college, who doesn't want to be so tone deaf
right.
on some of these things? What's your advice to them?
Right. This is probably like my third conference of this nature that I've been to, and whenever I come, people always say like, oh, it's so insightful, it's so great to hear from the students. If you're an administrator on campus or a member of staff, you could bring students into these conversations all the time. All you have to do is do outreach to them. Like I said in the panel, I really do believe in community-based participatory research and making sure that students are at the table when you're having these conversations about affordability, because there are new barriers that are surfacing all the time for students these days, and that even weren't there when recently graduated students were in college. So I think having students at the table to have those conversations and talk about the very real barriers that they've faced that might be recent, that administrators may not have faced when they went to college, and a lot of elected officials didn't face when they went to college, is really important.
I wanted to ask this question in the panel, but didn't have a chance to. When I was in college, like I was homeless for a while when I was growing up, and all of that, and when my university found out, they were really eager to write about me. Right, here's a success story. Like, oh, this guy, they even had a 2-page spread, and it was called desperate but not defeated. Yeah, and so it's like, how do we? Yeah, thank you. How do we? What's your suggestion though for? Participatory research is a great step. Inviting students into the conversation is a great step. But there's also this real danger of tokenism.
Yes.
And I guess I just wanted to, if you had thoughts on that, how have you seen that manifested? And are you worried about, potential tokenism even as you become, a champion for affordability from a very realistic today's student mindset? How do we avoid tokenism?
Yeah, I was actually just talking to Jamaica about this before. So I think we talked about compensating low-income students for the work that they do, especially if you're at a larger organization and you have the funds to do so. A lot of these higher education organizations will have students come in and, I don't want to say consult, but speak and share their stories and sort of provide a lot of insight to the practitioners and administrators that are there. But it's more like a garnish on a larger dish. And so we don't have a lot of input. We're just there to kind of take maybe an hour of their time giving some perspective. So making sure that you are actively and thoroughly compensating students for their work. And if you're working on a university campus and you're trying to bring in those students, making sure that it's a job for them. And so instead of, because lower income students in particular have a million other things they have to worry about. And so if administrators are bringing them in as consultants, making sure that you're giving them compensation for that, and maybe even giving them a position where they can do that full time and don't have to worry about other, jobs that they might have to do, or childcare, or that kind of thing. I would also say, making sure that you're opening the space up to be as empowering as possible. And I say, the more students that you can bring to these types of events, the better. And so instead of having 1 or 2 students present with a bunch of practitioners or administrators, making sure it's, maybe half students, and that there's a space for students to kind of talk about how they can work on their own advocacy projects alongside administrators.
So what I hear you saying is making sure that, one student doesn't bear the responsibility of representing an entire population.
Yes. So pay us for our work and also give us space to work alongside you instead of just kind of add insight to whatever else you're doing at a conference or, in a administrative project at your university.
Were you studying public policy before you got into all this work, or have you, is that something you started out on right away?
I think it's something I wanted to do when I got to college, but the program at the University of Michigan is you apply into a separate school your sophomore year, and so it's a 2-year program, and now I'm in the second year of the program.
Okay, great. And you went straight to University of Michigan, is that right? Is your first
I did,
choice? Are you
yes.
originally from Michigan?
I am. I'm from Warren, which is just north of Detroit.
Okay, I'm surprised you didn't give me the hand.
Oh yeah, if you want to know, I think it's like there.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're pretty close to being done with your studies. Is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
When do you finish?
In May is when I graduate.
Okay. Mm-hmm. What's next on the plate after May?
That's a really good question. So right now I am interning at a nonprofit. They're called We the People Michigan, and they're working to build a multiracial working class coalition across the state of Michigan. And they're headquartered in Detroit, and so they're doing a lot of really amazing work, and they don't have organizers in Macomb and Oakland County, and so I'm from Macomb County, and I went to school in Oakland County high school, and so I would love to fill that role and do some organizing in my hometown, especially because like post 2016 election, my hometown is one of those places that like the white working class voted for Obama and then they voted for Trump. Why did they do that? And so, figuring out what some of the needs are in my community and having them met in productive ways that don't involve voting for Trump.
And you mentioned, the guide is publicly available, right? Is that open
Yes.
to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
So if someone wants to check out the guide or learn, maybe there's some students listening who want to replicate or follow your example, where can they find it? How do they get in touch?
So we have a student organization that we founded to sort of do more advocacy work on campus. It's called the Michigan Affordability and Advocacy Coalition. It's MAC for short because it's a very long name. And so we have a Facebook page, and the guide is the pinned post. There's a link to it there. So we've been using that organization to sort of so the guide is like for resources that exist on campus. The organization is making more resources or advocating for more resources for low-income students.
We're going to pick up this conversation when we return by taking it to a national level. Stay with us. Rachel Fleischer has been building advocacy and public awareness for society's most complex challenges for nearly 2 decades. Now serving as executive director of Young Invincible, Rachel leads efforts to amplify the voices of young adults to expand economic opportunity for their generation. As a national organization, Young Invincibles takes on the issues of higher education, healthcare, workforce and finances, and civic engagement. Rachel joins us from Washington, D.C. today to talk about their work in higher education. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us today. And for those who aren't familiar, can you tell us a little bit more about Young Invincibles?
You bet. And thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. And one of my favorite things to do is talk about Young Invincibles. So I'm happy to tell you more about our organization. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy organization focused on driving policy change that expands economic opportunity for young people. For us, young people is defined as 18 to 34. And that policy change is focused on the intersection of young people's lives. So you had mentioned, healthcare, higher education, workforce, and civic engagement. And it really is sort of a crystallization of how those issues intersect and what we can do from a 360 perspective to really support young people, embrace them in terms of where they are in their lives today, and elevate their voices in the very policy change process that we are executing so that they are at the front lines advocating for the policy change that they want to see for them and for their colleagues. So that's really the heart and soul of Young Invincibles, is not only to drive policy change, but to make sure that the people that it benefits, young people in this situation, are actually the ones advocating for that policy change. And to do so, we have a number of ways that we work with young people to make sure that they have the confidence and the skills and the wherewithal to advocate confidently, successfully. And so that's sort of the kind of philosophy of our organization. we've got an office here in Washington, D.C., and then we've got offices across the country in California, in Texas, in Illinois, in Colorado, in New York. And it's through a mix of work by folks on the ground in those regions and then here in DC that we're able to move policies that are statewide and federal. And it's really a great organization focused on issues that are so important to young people. So I'm really proud to be here as the executive director.
I guess if you can, one place that we might want to dive into is, I hear you talking about, moving policy, and there's certainly, national, federal level policy, legislation, et cetera. You've also mentioned things at the state level. We also know there's a lot of like institutional level, individual, campus-based, for example, or workforce policy. Can you talk a little bit about the level of granularity that you and your staff at Young Invincibles get involved with and the kinds of things that you're trying to drive?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a great question. And we really do think about policy from an institutional level, regional, state, and then federal. So let me give you an example. Many of the young people that we work with are actually college students right now. And they want to see change on their campus. They want to see change in their region. They want to see change in their state, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we do is sort of think about the particular issue that we are focusing on, whether it's mental health, whether it's voting, whether it's higher education policy. We think about what are the changes and the possibilities on your particular campus, and how can we, as Young Invincibles, give you the skills you need to go and advocate for better access to mental health on your university? And then what are the state policy opportunities to also make change along those same lines? So the campus really ends up being kind of our framework for beginning the conversation and helping people build power on their campus through getting their peers involved in making something happen on their campus. Same thing with voting, for example. We talked about civic engagement. Young Invincibles launched and now runs the largest student voter engagement effort in the country. But it's not just about working with students. We're actually working with institutions to help them build sustaining infrastructure that enhances and student voter education and engagement. So we work with students to help them get involved with their campus administrators, their campus leaders, even leadership on a campus, to make sure that that school knows this is important to its students, this is what the students want, and here are all the ways that we Young Invincibles can help faculty members and professors and leadership work with its students to create these kinds of programs. So whether it's mental health, whether it's voting, whether it's access to childcare on a campus, which we know is so important for today's students. 1 in 4 students today actually is a parent already. So what are all the things that young people can do to make sure that that campus knows, that institution knows that it expects to have a childcare option for students that is affordable, accessible, and quality? That's actually connected to a federal program called C Campus. But there are things that you can do as a young person on your campus to help make sure that your institution is taking advantage of resources that are offered up federally through the C Campus program. Does that help sort of bring to life some of both the intersections of the layers of policy, but also the intersection of our issues?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're right. There's we can't wait for one actor or one body to solve all the challenges that today's students are facing. And I think the example of childcare that you just mentioned is a really great example of how local, institutional, state, and then federal policy kind of all can align when really well connected and intentionally connected to solve or mitigate some of the biggest barriers that our students face. We hear from folks all the time about trying to get student voice into policy conversations, or trying to get student voice into really any conversation that has to do with their life. And of course, today's student, meaning not just the traditional age that matriculates straight from high school, but in particular, you have this focus area of 18 to 34-year-olds. And I guess we've talked about childcare, but what are some of the other really big barriers that the young adults that you're working with are making you aware of and are trying to prioritize in this conversation?
Sure. I guess as a starting point, what we are hearing a lot about is like, first of all, young people want to go to college. They see it as an important step in the trajectory of their lives, both personally and professionally. And there are real challenges associated with that. One is cost. For many people, it's simply too affordable. And the process in applying for financial aid, grants, loans, you name it, is just so complicated. And so I think just sort of streamlining that as much as possible for young people, helping them know exactly what's available to them, what it means long term if they are taking out a loan, so that they're not surprised by the amount of debt that they're taking on afterwards and don't have the information early on, and then certainly don't have the information in terms of repayment. So cost. Um, Support, right? How are we building a culture of support to help young people complete school when they're there? There's a lot of conversation about the number of young people who drop out or who are delinquent on their payments or who default. And I think it's really important that we start flipping the script on that. This system is failing young people. Young people want to go to school. They want to finish. They want to, I don't know one young person who said, you know what I really want to do? I want to drop out or I want to default. No, no, no. They're going to school because they want to be going, and they need a system and programs that support them in finishing. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind and to think about the ways the system can actually support today's students and not students from 20 years ago. So completion support, wraparound services, childcare support, work study, apprenticeships, sort of pathways that allow people to work and do their studies and take care of their family all at the same time in really practical ways. So those are the kinds of things that come up. Equity comes up a lot. And maybe not necessarily with that word, but the idea and the values that surround equity. I want to make sure I know how to navigate this system, even though I'm a first generation college student and my parents haven't gone. That's an equity issue. I want to make sure that my dreamer colleagues out in the world can get access to financial aid just like I can. That's an equity issue. I want to make sure that people of color have the same opportunity to graduate from college and actually make a living that can support them economically as I can. That's an equity issue that comes up a lot. So what I really think is inspirational is that young people are not just thinking about themselves and their individual lives, but they're thinking about their friends and their communities, and want to make sure that whatever we do from a policy perspective supports young people as a whole, understanding the diversity of young people today. I think that's really important, and I really hope that our policymakers can think about that in the same kind of way.
Yeah. So shifting gears just a little bit, I think you've led campaigns in many different parts of the country in different subject areas. You have healthcare, now post-secondary education. Can you describe a little bit about what makes for a successful campaign in your view, regardless of the area and subject, and what do you think needs to be unique about policy and practice and communication efforts as it relates to campaigns for post-secondary education?
It's a really good question. I appreciate your asking. I mean, in my experience, and I've run, like you said, a number of campaigns around a number of complex issues, and there seems to be a process around all of them, which is first raising awareness about what the issue is, and then translating that awareness actually into caring, and then figuring out how to channel that care to support a specific policy, and then turning support into demand, so that there is an urgency not only for you, the individual who cares about this issue, because it either benefits you personally, or you care so much about it for your larger community. But it's going from awareness to action, and that is an important process. And then taking that action and translating it into, I would say, a political priority, so that people are so compelled that they are saying to their elected officials, "You must do this, and if you don't, there will be a political price." That takes time. That takes focus, that takes attention, that takes resources. And it is, I think, even more challenging today because there's so many things that need attention. So there was almost a competition for attention in terms of getting people to drop everything they've got and go out and make clear that this is the one thing that they need their elected officials to do. So I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity. The opportunity is people are more fired up than ever, and they are willing to use every vehicle they have, their own stories, their social media properties, their time, their family time, to make clear that this is something that they care about. I think also that there are always new ways that people are showcasing that support and demand. I think Twitter is a great example. So what's the next big thing? It's sort of like we have to be even more creative now to get lawmakers to pay attention.
How do we do that within post-secondary? I think when we think of big national campaigns and trying to get a nation swell of individuals who are interested in first, most people don't really resonate with the word post-secondary, so we typically say college, and then you hear the narrative like, well, college isn't for everybody. And so I guess I'm trying to get a little bit of an understanding from you about how do we do this effectively? What advice do you have for people who are saying it's just hard to get the barber, the plumber, the line chef to care about these post-secondary issues that you're driving on. It's not as tangible. It's not a pocketbook issue as much as maybe healthcare is, for example. Mm-hmm. What advice do you have for folks to try to cultivate that?
Yeah, I think we have a real opportunity to articulate to the public broadly that investments in public education are societal issues, and that if we do it the right way, it benefits everybody. And certainly more and more we're seeing the issue of student debt actually impact generations of families, not just young people themselves. So I think that is potentially a unifier that could bring more people into the fight, if you will. What's really interesting, especially for me coming in and being newer to Young Invincibles, I'm about 10 months old, just like 10 months in, there's actually a good deal of bipartisan support for many of the things that we've been talking about. What there isn't is a fire. There isn't urgency. And I actually think if we organized and gave people very clear marching orders, people being, constituents across the country, to say there is this thing called HEA reauthorization, and it is something that is tied to student debt. It is something that is tied to access to quality programs. It's something that's tied to completion. It's tied to all these things that we're talking about. So call it what you want. There's this thing, and now is the time for you to stand up and let your elected official know that they have to go and do this thing called HEA reauthorization, and here's what it needs to include. Sort of connecting the dots for people and framing it in a way that they see it actually does benefit them. That barber may not have kids himself, but maybe he's got grandkids, or maybe he has a niece or nephew who's really struggling. And so it's like making that connection, making it personal, and giving people something very simple to do. I think part of the challenge in the post-secondary arena is where there's all these different things we're trying to do. And I think we have to figure out how do we cluster all of them together and just put it under one banner that people can respond to and say, yes, I'm going to put my time and energy and use my voice to make sure my elected official knows that this is the thing I need them to do.
And so as we kind of wrap up, I guess, you're talking to an audience now. What is that call to action that Young Invincibles has for the nation?
I said it yesterday and people laughed at me, but I'm going to go for it here. It's HE hey. It is about time. No more HEA. It is hey, we need to do this now. 2019 legislative session is around the corner. New Congress, and we don't know what's going to happen in 2020, and we got to make this happen now. We got to play every hand, and now is our time to get the Higher Education Act reauthorized the way that students need it to be both for today and for tomorrow. That's our big call to action. No more waiting.
He, hey, I love that. That's like a good hashtag that we should, that you all, I'm sure, have already thought of.
I'm testing it out and people are responding to it. So maybe we'll just go with it.
Yeah. Well, hey, I definitely will. Well, Rachel, thanks so much for coming on today. We really appreciate hearing about you and the work that Young Invincibles is doing. And I hope we can catch up again soon.
Yeah, I would love that. I really appreciate your reaching out, and good luck with the podcast. Super exciting.
Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Today we are joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Katherine Wheatle from Lumina Foundation, in a new segment we're calling Pop Ed. Pop Ed is a recurring segment that talks about the eccentric and growing overlap between higher education and pop culture. When we were talking about starting this segment, it was just really a fun kind of whiteboard idea until Katherine, who is a higher education historian and scholar, really took me to school on this. So I have a feeling she's going to do the same again. So here we go. Pop Ed. Hey, Katherine, welcome so much to the show.
Hi, Dakota. Thanks for having me. You are fulfilling a life dream to be able to talk about pop culture and higher ed. It is in my heart. So I appreciate the opportunity.
I know. I'm so excited. I was talking to someone. They're like, what is, pop ed? Like, what do you mean pop culture and higher ed? So I need you to school me. Take me to school here about all this.
Right. So I was a student affairs practitioner. And a lot of the ways that we connected with students was what was happening in popular culture. And one of those things is that colleges, universities, higher education culture shows up in very strange and interesting ways in pop culture. And it helps to shape what the general public thinks about higher ed, who it's for, if it's for them, and what the issues are. You see that in movies and TV and music. If someone makes a comment about what's good for college, who's a college dropout, and what that means for them, what degree do you need and not need. And so I think it's just important to be aware of what are the messages that students and the general public are receiving about post-secondary education, and what are ways that we can tap into those messages to infuse some evidence in some of the practices that work for students today.
That's great. So what do you got for us? What are we talking about today then?
Yeah, so the inaugural Pop Ed segment, we have to talk about the king, someone who is a favorite around the foundation. We're talking about King Beyonce.
That's right.
So what does Beyonce have to do with higher education? So Beyonce never attended higher ed, is wildly successful, but has developed her own foundation called Be Good. And Be Good has, in conjunction with her husband, Sean Carter, through the Sean Carter Foundation, have worked together over the years to develop these wildly popular scholarship programs. So in 2017, Mrs. Knowles Carter announced the establishment of the Formation Scholars Program that gave scholarships to female students in the creative arts, in music, in African American studies at 4 institutions. And so this year, this summer, after her Coachella performance, which amplified HBCU culture and HBCUs broadly, she announced 2 things as a follow-up kind of to the Formation Scholars Program. First, the Homecoming Awards program that gave scholarships to qualifying HBCUs, which was then matched later on by Google and expanded from 4 to 8, right? And that was in conjunction with one of our partners, United Negro College Fund. Then she announced a collaboration with the fashion powerhouse Balmain, and proceeds went to UNCF. So while she was on tour this year, the On the Run 2 tour She and her husband, in conjunction with their two foundations, announced that $1 million in scholarships to 11 exemplary high school students. And so these big scholarship programs are fantastic, right? No one is ever going to knock um, identifying students that are fantastic, doing these wonderful things in their academic careers, and how that can launch them into what happens after college. Well, what are some ways that we could leverage that attention, leverage those resources? The things that we do at Lumina Foundation is not just about the grant making, but it's also about the systemic ways in which, and the strategy that we use to change what happens in higher education. So, one of the lessons learned is that, look, celebrities bring a lot of power, bring a lot of resources, bring a lot of attention to issues in higher ed in ways that we just can't. And it invokes conversation about what does affordability look like. And uh, yes, so those 4 students, those 11 students do well, right? They have access to 25 grand, 100 grand across their time in undergrad. But how can we expand that? How can we scale that for policies, for strategies that are happening for affordability in the field? It carries a lot of excitement and a lot of good, but only for a short period of time and for a small number of students.
Mhm.
And so, some questions I think about when I see these scholarship programs are, if we do have well off family foundations that want to support students in higher ed, how can we systematically talk about other fees and other things that make affordability difficult beyond the tuition and fees? What could housing, food, and transportation look like for students that are returning? What could micro grants look like for students who have previous bills and debt that creates a barrier for them to re-enroll? Or graduation fees that make it difficult. You get to 90 credits and then you can't afford the graduation fee.
Mm.
So, what are some things that we can do in conjunction that helps to maximize that big pot of resources and that excitement to bring some evidence and research to what's happening in the field?
Yeah, so like for the formation scholars, right? So Beyonce says, "Great, we're gonna do this scholarship."
Mhm.
Do you know? I mean, is that again just like a just tuition scholarship, or are those dollars
Mhm.
that are able to be applied to some of the things that you're talking about?
Right. So the first year, I think, and someone at Parkwood Entertainment could tap me on Twitter and say, "Girl, you got it wrong." But I believe the Formation Scholars was specifically tuition.
Mm.
And then the Homecoming Scholars, those students have access to those dollars and may be able to use it beyond tuition and fees. And once again, we don't want to be in the business of telling family foundations what they should and shouldn't do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But thinking big, what could it look like to have a partnership with a family foundation like Be Good, like the Sean Carter Foundation, that brings notoriety to the communities of color, the communities that we care about, making sure that we're increasing attainment and access and completion um, toward things that are moving in states, in talent hubs, and communities across the nation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? We were just, I was just looking at this report, a draft report that's about to come out, from Nashville, where they listened to a bunch of adult learners. And, even in Tennessee, where it's essentially, no cost community college for adults or for traditional age students, they are still saying that all these folks had all these other real life challenges, transportation. There was one adult learner who said that trying to get to their local community college via bus took 3 hours, whereas if they had access to a car, it would take 15 minutes. And so it's just those other challenges that are really keeping people back from post-secondary. And so what I hear you saying is that, like, hey, Beyonce, right? And hey, a bunch of other folks who want to follow and be like Beyonce, think about some of the other kind of non-tuition kind of supports that you might be able to use your funding for. Is that kind of what you're getting at here?
Right. So covering someone's tuition may not be as sexy,
Mm-hmm.
but it can still be transformative for someone who can't afford a bus pass to get to the community college, or someone who has a past due bill and that creates an administrative hold and then they can't re-enroll. Those things are powerful and help us to get to completion and attainment.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was great. Thank you. And I think that's a great way to kick off this segment.
Wait, I have to do my shameless plea.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What's your shameless plea?
My shameless plea is, if anyone who is watching this, please share it with Be Good and the Sean Carter Foundation, because we would love to be in partnership to talk about these things and find ways to expand their reach and to help students in a systematic way.
Mm-hmm. Is there we need to get like a hashtag or something going on that, right? Like to try to get their attention. We should put our minds together on that one.
We should. That's going to be a communications campaign.
That's right. That's right.
That's all I have.
That was so much fun. We have to do this more often.
Yes, yeah. Of course. Thank you for having me. And anytime we need to prepare for Pop Ed, I'm there.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Katherine Wheatle from Lumina, doing a whole lot for us, but also our resident pop culture expert. Thanks so much, Katherine, for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you.
Bye.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent. If you have a comment or an idea for a future show, reach us at luminafoundation.org or reach me on Twitter @DakotaPalicki. Thanks for joining us.